trying to alleviate the suffering of the Nicaraguan people. The United States must continue to show leadership within the OAS, has passed resolutions condemning the government's use of violence and reaffirming the hemisphere's collective concern over the deterioration
America and the Caribbean at the Freedom House.
Thank you.
Thank you all
and
for being
allies
here.
to exert maximum pressure on the Ortega regime. Trying to alleviate the suffering of the deterioration. Must continue to show leadership within the OAS to exert maximum pressure on the Ortega regime. Trying to alleviate the suffering of the deterioration. Must continue to show leadership within the OAS.
Repressed protesters. In the context of demonstrations, more than 300 people were killed and more than 2,000 were seriously injured. Many of the people detained during the crackdown were subject to serious abuses that in some cases amounted to torture, including electric shocks, severe beatings, nail removal, asphyxiation, and rape. Authorities' abuses of protesters remain unpunished. Moreover, President Ortega promoted top officials who bear responsibility for the abuses. The government has also threatened, harassed, expelled, and jailed those who expose its abuses, including independent journalists, human rights defenders, international monitors, and NGOs. Several of the human rights defenders and journalists targeted during the crackdown have been long-standing critics of Ortega and had already been victims of harassment before the protest started. Since the beginning of the protest, Nicaragua's police and armed pro-government groups have operated jointly to detain hundreds of demonstrators. Armed pro-government groups have also abducted many people, at times holding them in secret detention facilities. On March 20, 2019, the Nicaraguan government agreed to release all people detained in the context of the protest by June 18, and to drop the charges against them in an effort to persuade the international community, and particularly the US government, to lift sanctions against them. Human rights defenders and other critics of the governments have increasingly become the targets of death threats, harassment, judicial persecution, and even expulsion from the country. Between November 29 and December 13, 2018, Nicaragua's Congress stripped 9 non-governmental organizations of their legal registration, effectively forcing them to shut down. Congressman Filiberto Rodriguez of the ruling party introduced the motions stripping them of registration at the request of the Interior Ministry. On the night of December 13, the National Police raided 5 of these organizations, confiscating many documents and computers. The NGOs' shutdowns were followed by criminal charges against prominent human rights defenders and the expulsion of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission and previously the representatives of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Since April 18 of last year, police and armed pro-government groups have harassed, intimidated, assaulted, and detained journalists. 2 foreign journalists reporting on the crackdown were deported in August and October of last year. The government has shut down critical news channels. Since April 2018, 56 Nicaraguan journalists have gone into exile. According to the United Nations High Commissioners for Refugees, more than 60,000 Nicaraguans have fled the country since the protests began in April 2018, with the majority, 55,000 of them, seeking refuge in Costa Rica. We support the application of the Global Magnitsky Act in July of 2018 and December of 2018, when the US Treasury Department imposed sanctions on 5 Nicaraguans implicated in human rights abuses and corruption, including National Police Commissioner Francisco Diaz, and also Vice President Rosario Murillo. The Nicaraguan Human Rights Anti-Corruption Act, NICA Act, passed on December 20th of 2018, expanded on the Global Magnitsky Act to allow the US government to take additional action against egregious human rights abuses taking place in Nicaragua. We urge Congress to consider its immediate implementation against human rights abusers in Nicaragua who have yet to be held accountable, and look forward to working with you on these efforts. My last remarks are going to be related to the amnesty legislation, amnesty law that was passed this weekend in Nicaragua. On June 8, the Nicaraguan National Assembly passed a broad amnesty law for crimes committed in the context of anti-government protest. The recent release of over 150 people who were arrested during the protest shows that the law is not necessary to release the political prisoners who are still behind bars. On the contrary, the law could be used to benefit officers responsible for abuses. The law indicates that crimes, quote, regulated in international treaties ratified by Nicaragua, end of a quote, will be excluded from the amnesties. Yet, given lack of judicial independence in Nicaragua, there is a serious risk that the law will be used to consolidate the impunity that officers responsible for serious abuses in the country have enjoyed today. According to the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the available information indicates that only one member of the armed pro-government groups, only one member of those kind of groups has been convicted for crimes documented by the High Commissioner, Human Rights Office of United Nations. And not a single police officer is being investigated for these atrocities. Not a single police officer of the Nicaraguan police has been investigated, prosecuted, or charged for atrocities committed in violation of human rights last year and the current year. The law provides, finally, that people who engage in new crimes will have their amnesty revoked. Given the government's record of prosecuting critics, there is a risk that this provision will be misused to persecute former political prisoners who continue to criticize the dictatorship of Ortega after their release. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Maradiaga, you are now recognized for testimony.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of this subcommittee. It is an honor to be here today. Chairman Cires, thank you for paying special attention to the very serious situation in Nicaragua. Since his return to power in 2006, Daniel Ortega has taken over Nicaragua's institutions to remain in power, causing widespread corruption, human rights abuses, and a collapsing economy. Ortega and his inner circle constitute a clear and present danger not only to the people of Nicaragua, but also to the entire hemisphere. In the face of this, Nicaraguans have joined together to restore liberty, justice, and democracy. In April 2018, Nicaraguans from all walks of life joined pro-democracy protests demanding respect for human rights, the resignation of Ortega, and early, free, and internationally monitored elections. The response was a brutal government crackdown on protesters that caused the death of over 300 civilians. Talks between the regime and the opposition had repeatedly failed. In May of this year, negotiations were suspended as a result of the assassination of political prisoner Eddie Montes, a U.S. Navy veteran with dual citizenship who was retired in Nicaragua. His killing inside the notorious La Modelo prison outraged Nicaraguans because he was shot by prison guards with an AK-47 while unarmed. Ortega has violated preliminary agreements. Instead, his regime continues to perpetrate human rights violations, including extrajudicial killings, torture, sexual abuse of prisoners, arbitrary detention, and other crimes against humanity. These violations make it increasingly difficult for the opposition to resume negotiations. The regime continues to persecute citizens who actively participated in the protests, causing an unprecedented exodus of refugees not seen since the Nicaraguan Civil War of the 1980s. Over 100,000 people have fled the country since the conflict began. The vast majority remains in Costa Rica under dire conditions. Although the response of the government of Costa Rica has been admirable, the international community has ignored that there is a humanitarian crisis of Nicaraguan refugees in Costa Rica. We have also seen an increase of Nicaraguans escaping from political persecution and seeking asylum in the United States. Their need for asylum is legitimate, and they would face certain death or incarceration if they return. At least 2,000 people have been imprisoned for participating in anti-Sandinista protests, and while most of them have been released on house arrest due to national and international pressure, many remain in arbitrary detention. The regime continues to use human beings as bargaining chips. An additional 200 activists, myself included, have arrest warrants under bogus charges. Ortega controls the national police, who reports directly to him and his wife. In the case of the military, once Ortega rose to power, he sent generals that were considered professional into early retirement and promoted those that were loyal to him. Despite immense personal risks, the people of Nicaragua continue to struggle for democratic change. All forms of peaceful protest have been prohibited. Sandinista paramilitary constantly intimidate members of the opposition. All major cities are militarized. Nicaragua is now a police state. We, the Nicaraguan people, are fighting for our freedom. We are not asking the international community to solve our problems. But since our struggle is nonviolent, we need robust international support in the form of targeted sanctions against human rights violators. We also need the swift implementation of the Nicaragua Human Rights and Anti-Corruption Act, the NICA Act. Without such support, Nicaragua is doomed to become another Venezuela. Effective international pressure requires coordinated action by key allies in the Western Hemisphere. It is unacceptable that some member states of the Organization of American States are supporting the tyranny of Ortega. The application of the Inter-American Democratic Charter is imperative to achieve democracy in Nicaragua. Ortega is a relic of the Cold War. And just like the Communist Party of Cuba and Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela, he embodies a legacy of oppression against dignity. The Nicaraguan people are ready for a new path. Last year, over 40 organizations from civil society and diverse political movements agreed on a common manifesto of national unity. This pro-democracy movement is ready to build a new Nicaragua. Your democratic solidarity will be instrumental in helping us achieve the freedom Nicaraguans deserve. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Ponce, you are now recognized.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman Cires, Ranking Member Rooney, and other members. Thanks for keeping an eye on Nicaragua. Nicaragua is also in the map. It's not only about Venezuela, it's also Nicaragua. And it's part of the solution needs to bring Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela free. The massive popular uprising with youth, peasant, autoconvocados claiming democracy in Nicaragua last year was not a random political situation. The crisis has been in the making for decades. Daniel Ortega failed Sandinista revolution, corruption, and economic disaster from 1971 to 1990, along with the came with the negotiation of the international community, and that forced the autocrat to organize the first democratic election in 1990. That was the first time for Nicaragua in 50 years to have a democratic elected government. Finally, Daniel Ortega was defeated after 11 years in power at that time. But Daniel Ortega continued his obsession of power. He was the candidate at the election in 1990, 1996, 2001, and he received only 30% of the vote in each one of those elections. But he became a major force behind an obstruction for the democratic government to rule the country. The corruption also from some of the government that ruled Nicaragua, particular the Alemán, it drove Daniel Ortega into power again. The division about the principal political party allowed Daniel Ortega to win in 2006 only with 38% of the vote. Then the pact became in force between Alemán and Daniel Ortega, allowing Daniel Ortega to control all the institutions, to control the parliament. Only with 30% of the vote, Daniel Ortega began to control the parliament, control the judiciary, and became the force of change in Nicaragua. He controlled all the institutions, and he began a process to re-elect himself, and we have this government in Nicaragua because of the obsession of power of Daniel Ortega. After numerous pressures against the regime acceded to have some negotiation for changing the electoral rules in 2016, but he never fulfilled that commitment. So Daniel Ortega continued with his obsession of power. He has been ruling for 24 years. Nicaragua, and he has been in the opposition and ruling the country directly for 4 decades. So Daniel Ortega is not an easy one to negotiate with. After 30 years of in power, Daniel Ortega dismantling the institutions, some groups began to organize themselves. The obsession of power of Daniel Ortega forced him to take control of some of the land with the canal. That forced the campesinos movement to begin a movement against Daniel Ortega that became popular. And Daniel Ortega simply crushed the movement at that time. But the youth begins to feel there was no alternative for Nicaragua. And last year, after a major environmental crisis with the Parque El Indio, and then with the effort with Daniel Ortega to dismantle the Social Security, increasing the taxes of Social Security and the violence against the all from the Social Security, Daniel Ortega created his major crisis. That crisis forced the youth movement to go to the street and begin the demonstration, and Daniel Ortega just crushed the demonstrations and began to kill using his militias and the police, directly engaged in violence in the rest of the country. By that time, Ortega felt that he needed to negotiate. He begins to call for a negotiation with the youth and the campesinos, and he failed in his word for changing the situation in the country. Daniel Ortega has been manipulating the country and offering negotiation for all this time. None of the opportunities in which Daniel Ortega offered negotiation has been working. Now Daniel Ortega is seeing 2021 as an opportunity, but if we allow Daniel Ortega to manipulate the negotiation and run again, Daniel Ortega will win the next election in 2021. Daniel Ortega has been supported by the COSEP and by the members of the private sector, so they need to get on board for a change, a real change in Nicaragua. We need to increase the pressure against the regime in Nicaragua. Even though the U.S. administration has been imposing sanctions against some of the members of the regime, the family of Daniel Ortega, it has been only 8 sanctions in all this time. And the NICA Act is not being implemented, waiting for some negotiation with Daniel Ortega. Unless we increase the pressure against the Daniel Ortega inner circle and the family, unless we begin to put pressure in the police and the military to increase the sanctions against them, for them to be a force of change, unless we create a major commitment of the rest of the country in the region to also impose sanctions against the regime, and also monitor the situation with the Organization American States to prevent a bad negotiation with the regime that's going to bring an electoral change, but an electoral change is not going to bring a change into the country, because the country will not change unless Ortega is taken out of power. And for an open, free, and democratic election, Ortega cannot be a candidate and cannot be in place when that election happens. We need to implement the NICA Act. I believe the Congress has an opportunity right now to force the change in Nicaragua with more sanctions and putting pressure for the regime to open the doors, not for a house arrest. It's a time for the Nicaragua to be free. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ponce. Now we will go to questions. You know, I was one of the sponsors with Liliana Rose-Layton of the NICA Act. And obviously, this effort was to reduce Ortega's access to foreign finance and impose sanctions on Nicaraguan officials responsible for human rights violation. I guess, Dr. Ponce, you don't believe that the NICA Act has been effective? And I wonder, what do you think? Dr. Ponce?
I believe that the NICA Act is effective, but we need to implement the NICA Act in full, not only 8 sanctions. I believe we need to increment the pressure against the regime. We need to bring also members of the police into our sanction process. We need to include members of the military and some of the members of the business sector that have been collaborating with the Ortega regime. My view is that the Ortega regime has been using the negotiation to stop the sanction, trying to negotiate, liberating some, house arrest to some prisoners, and leaving the situation. Remember that Daniel Ortega has a close relationship also with Venezuela. Venezuela gave Daniel Ortega $5 billion with Albanesa and other charities. So it's a country with all this problem involved.
Mr. Vivanco?
Mr. Chairman, the regime in Nicaragua is, I think it's fair to characterize today that government as a dictatorship. And it's run by Mr. Ortega and his wife, the vice president. Based on the record of Ortega, it seems to me that Nicaragua is run today by a politician who is essentially a transactional one, somebody who might change its record based on the pressure exercised on him and his government, locally as well as by international community. I do believe that the global Magnitsky Law is a fantastic instrument to exercise pressure, not only on Nicaragua, but at a global level. And the fact that few members of that administration has been targeted last year is extremely important. Now, last year also you passed a specific Magnitsky or NICA Act for Nicaragua. And that one is the law that is still pending for application. We do believe that the only way to make some meaningful progress in terms of transition to democracy in Nicaragua and respect for fundamental freedoms and human rights depends in many ways on the international pressure and particularly the implementation of the specific NICA Act. Thank you.
Mr. Maradiaga?
One of the lessons learned from nonviolent movements around the world is that they can only be effective with robust international support. In this regard, the NICA Act is a fantastic example of how the international community can support such movements. And as Mr. Vivanco and Dr. Ponce has emphasized, this is a fantastic tool that has not been fully implemented. In addition to the NICA Act, it's important to emphasize the importance of coordination in the Western Hemisphere. I would like to highlight the fact that countries such as Honduras and Guatemala, for example, have been, in effect, blocking many of the activities inside the Organization of American States. We have other examples. The government of Taiwan, for example, have provided a lifeline to the regime of Ortega of over $100 million. So it's not only the action of the United States, but we request the coordinated action of those countries that regard themselves as part of the free world. However, their actions are not compatible to what they're doing towards the Ortega regime.
Thank you. Ranking Member Rooney.
Thank you, Chairman Sears. I appreciate that. I'd like to ask Dr. Ponce first about your assessment, given the fact you noted the need for more effective sanctions. What's your assessment of the opposition, their unity, their ability to bring about a democratic transition? Start with Dr. Ponce, then the others.
Well, what we see in Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua is the dictatorship manual. They apply the same. They divided the opposition by the opposition. Some of the members of COSEPA has been in bed with the regime just because there's a golden opportunity, or was a golden opportunity, with $5 billion from Venezuela, with all the corruption. So it was a good opportunity. And some of the members of the opposition has been divided, and some of them, the success with the pact with Alemán gave power to Daniel Ortega again. Daniel Ortega learned the lesson, and he has been applying that. He even became Catholic, evangelical, or whatever. He has been transforming himself. He's a powerful guy, and he will not leave power. The thing with the opposition, they need, yes, they're going to be divided, but we need to help also to consolidate the power in the countryside. We need to help the campesinos movement to become a major force. We need to help the youth to be more active again in Nicaragua and consolidate power in the countryside. We need to help the opposition also to consolidate political parties. They're going to defeat all the forces behind Daniel Ortega in 2021. Daniel Ortega is organizing everything for 2021, but the opposition is fighting against themselves. So it is an opportunity to strengthen it.
If I might, you make an interesting point. I've heard from some people that I know there that the popularity of Ortega is much less outside of Managua and maybe Grenada, and maybe is there an opportunity to exploit that?
We have several tools. Congress has been increasing the budget for Nicaragua, for democracy in Nicaragua. We have the sanctions in our hands, so it is time to implement those tools to support political parties, to support the Alianza, to support the campesinos, to support the faith-based group and the youth and the autoconvocados to begin a force in Nicaragua in the whole country.
Okay, Professor Maradiaga. Also, can you also comment about this Taiwan thing? Imagine, if anybody needs a friend like the United States, you'd think it'd be Taiwan. I mean, we need to just focus on that one more time, that they gave all that money to Nicaragua.
Indeed, and that's an example of the double standards. It's very unfortunate, and with this Taiwan loan and some other similar support from the Inter-American Bank of Integration, the BESIE, and also from the support of South Korea, basically Mr. Ortega has a liquidity for the rest of this year. So many of the efforts that the OAS is doing, that the United States government is doing, in a way are affected by these double standards. So that's why my emphasis on coordination, it's important. I comment on the opposition, and I agree with Dr. Ponce. The manual is the same. These regimes have the mechanisms to make it close to impossible for the opposition to participate. And that's why opposition, it's, I wouldn't say divided, but it's very difficult to function under political persecution, under arbitrary arrest. So there are some opposition members that pick tactics that are low risk in order to remain in the country. There are some other members of the opposition, myself included, that have taken some other risk, and that's why we are in exile, some others are in prison. And the only solution to move towards a new path is to restore basic freedom. So a robust opposition can organize in Nicaragua.
Dr. Babenko?
I'm sorry, I don't have any comments about the unity of the opposition in Nicaragua.
Here in the last couple of seconds then that I have, does anyone have any comment about the realistic opportunities we may have to strengthen this opposition then, and the odds of their success? Dr. Ponce or Dr. Maradiaga?
The people of Nicaragua see Ortega as a tyrant of the past. And some people do not believe in the polls, but Ortega was quite popular some years ago, precisely because of $5 billion. It's an amount that is unprecedented in Nicaraguan history for a country of 6 million people. So he was able to do some stuff that brought a lot of of people in Nicaragua. But going back to the polls, about 1 of every 2 Nicaraguans are willing for a new path. Ortega has about 20% support if we believe polls by Sid Gallup and Victor Borges, another service in Nicaragua. So he's at his lowest point right now. And the opposition has a fair chance. But the only way for the opposition to be effective is for the opposition to have the ability to move in the country, to organize. For the last 11 years, Daniel Ortega has declared any effective opposition group illegal. Many political parties have been declared illegal. So it's important to not only to have a snapshot of the opposition right now, but to understand that for 11 consecutive years, being a true opposition in Nicaragua has been regarded a crime by Ortega.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Congressman Levin?
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding this really important hearing. I want to take a longer view. So far, I think we've gone back to 2018 here. But I want to ask you about how the U.S. can best be helpful here, given our history. The U.S. occupied Nicaragua for over 2 decades, a century ago. And then we supported the Somoza dictatorship, which ruled Nicaragua completely undemocratically for over 40 years. And as I think a 19-year-old or 18-year-old college student, I remember when the Sandinistas overthrew the dictatorship. And in my office, I have a T-shirt quilt that includes one little T-shirt celebrating 1 year of freedom in Nicaragua, which feels like a very bittersweet T-shirt today. And then, of course, the United States supported the Contras in the 80s. So the United States has not always been a friend of democracy in Nicaragua. And here we are today with Ortega acting like a transactional, as you said, Mr. Vivanco, strongman. It's so troubling. So I want to ask you in particular, and let me say one more thing. When I was a law student, Mr. Vivanco, I worked for your organization during my first summer of law school in Haiti after Aristide was overthrown the first time, and wrote with one other researcher a sort of book-length report on the destruction of civil society in the aftermath of that overthrow. And so I'm not so interested in the opposition my question is, how can the U.S. strengthen, sort of deal with this very problematic regime in a way that actually builds democracy? And how can we support human rights organizations that are working there? I don't think you've said much about that. You've tried maybe in your testimony you submitted, but how can we provide support and resources to assist human rights defenders and civil society organizations that are obviously under threat, people being tortured and killed for their work? What can we do more to help them?
Thank you very much, Congressman Levin, for your question. And look, on the first point that you raised, which is the record of the U.S. in Nicaragua, and I will argue in the whole region.
Yes.
Is not, is far from perfect, on the contrary. Given the relationship of the government, of the U.S. government, for instance, with the governments of in South America, like Chile, and others, obviously is a record that deserves obviously a serious scrutiny. And I agree with you about your assessment of the intervention in Nicaragua historically by the U.S. government. Now, we are in the 21st century, and we are looking at the respect and promotion of fundamental freedoms and rights. If we believe that those rights and freedoms are universal and they should be defended and promoted all over the world, I do believe that the US government today, and this Congress in particular, has a responsibility and leadership to play in coordination with other democracies in the world, particularly in Europe and in Latin America. A multilateral approach to the case of Nicaragua could be much more effective. Mr. Madariaga insisted about this point, and I think he has a point, in terms of urging this administration, ideally the Trump administration, the State Department, to work multilaterally in terms of pressing the government for change and protecting civil society and NGOs and journalists who are trying to do their work.
Well, my time's expired, but I just want to ask you before I end, if you can share with me later particular ideas about how to, which vehicles and which countries are active, and I'd be very much like to help in that effort.
Delighted. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Congressman Guest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Ponce, in your written testimony on page 3, under a couple different subheadings, one entitled International Partners in Crime and the other entitled Uprisings in the Market, you list 3 countries that have a close relationship with Nicaragua, one being Cuba, which you describe as Communist Cuba's influence is unmistakable. You talk about Russia providing the regime with weapons and expertise, and then you also talk a little bit about China and the Grand Interoceanic Canal. Could you please expand on the role those 3 governments are playing in the Nicaraguan government at this time?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. In the case of Venezuela, $5 billion, and Venezuela has been involved directly in the process of supporting the corruption in Nicaragua. Part of the payments to the public sector has been paid with money from Venezuela, Albanesa, and the U.S. has been sanctioned Albanesa for corruption, money laundering, and the involvement in drug trafficking in Nicaragua. With China has been supporting, and China, well, it was a Chinese planning with Daniel Ortega, major corruption with the Interoceanic Canal, and there are some information about Russia operating in Nicaragua. They have a building in Nicaragua, and the people in Nicaragua say that more than 200 Russians operate in Nicaragua, and there are some concerns about the weapons distributed by the Russians in Nicaragua. Russia has been providing for military armor, military weapons for the last 5 to 6 years to Nicaragua. Some of the people that I talk that have been in prison have been telling me that some of the people that are in all the prisoners claim that they hear Cuban voices when they have been tortured in prison. And it makes sense because it's the same model of torture. If you see the torture in Venezuela, it's rape, it's sexual abuse, and different kind of torture. That is the same model implemented in Venezuela and in Nicaragua. The level of response of the management of the forces, they have been repressing the civilians at the streets. It is a military training. And some of the people have been saying that the Russian and the Cuban and the Venezuelan has been trained in military, the paramilitary, the groups that support Daniel Ortega directly with weapons. The weapons, when they began the repression, came to Nicaragua in a matter of days. Several planes, some people in Nicaragua claim the Cuban planes and Venezuela planes arrived to Nicaragua with weapons to reinforce the pro-government violent groups in Nicaragua.
And just very briefly, also about the Chinese investment in Nicaragua. We've got, and we've seen in the past and had hearings on the Belt to Road Initiative where China is investing in developing countries, and we're seeing that in Venezuela, are we not? Or excuse me, in Nicaragua, are we not?
In Nicaragua, China is not so active, apart from the canal, because Taiwan has been supporting more the government of Nicaragua. Taiwan has been a major provider of support of Nicaragua. The Chinese has been acting in Nicaragua, but not as active as in Venezuela.
And then finally, you talked about if Ortega is allowed to run, he will be reelected, and you talk about the need for additional sanctions. Do you believe if additional sanctions are imposed that we will see someone else step forward and run for president if in fact those sanctions were in fact imposed by our government?
The problem with the sanctions right now is we only impose sanctions to the inner circle of Daniel Ortega. Daniel Ortega's wife, Daniel Ortega kids, and the people that work with Daniel Ortega. We're not expanding the sanctions to members of the police that were part of the repression, members of the military who were part for inaction or direct action against the civilians in Nicaragua. And we feel, we see that how the regime has been reacting to the sanctions. They are desperate every time that the U.S. impose any sanctions. They asking for lifting the sanctions in the negotiation with the alliance. That's one of the first topic in the negotiation, lifting the sanctions. Yes, I do believe that more sanctions in Nicaragua will be effective. Listen, we are not asking any of the witness. Nobody's asking for intervention. Nobody's asking for anything. We are asking for sanctions and economic support and technical support to the opposition to be more effective in terms of getting rid of this regime, this terrible regime.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Congressman Espaillat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Maradiaga, you told us that there are nation-states in the Organization of American States that are clearly supportive of Nicaragua and what's going on right now. Could you tell us who they are for the record?
Yes, sir. Most of these are Caribbean states who remain very close to the Petro-Caribe arrangement.
Can you tell us their names?
With all due respect, I do not have the name of particular 8 Caribbean islands that, but they're part of the CARICOM. You know, and I apologize for not having precisely the name of those states. But if I may add, what is particularly worrisome is neighboring states, particularly Honduras and Guatemala, because many of these island states of the Caribbean have argued that if neighboring states are not taking concrete actions, it's difficult for them, and of course this is an excuse, it's difficult for them to take action. So we believe it's important to emphasize that Honduras and Guatemala should be on the right side of history by supporting the OAS.
So please, if you can, give us that list for the record whenever you can, who those states.
I will immediately do so after the hearing, yes.
Okay. Dr. Ponce, you said that the problem has been that we have only applied Magnitsky Act sanctions on the immediate Ortega clan, right? Are you willing to give us the list of names of some of those other folks that you feel should get Magnitsky Act sanctions with some level of background on why they should?
Yes, of course. I have been providing names for the last 3 years, even for the first one, Rivas, and some proof about some of these people. I believe that some other people from close to the regime need also to be included in the sanction, and knowing that we can lift the sanctions as soon as they collaborate with a democratic solution in Nicaragua. They're going to provide that.
My next question is, although there's been a major crisis in Nicaragua, there hasn't been a migration crisis that have shown up at our southern border, like, for example, the number of Hondurans or the numbers of Guatemalans that show up at our borders due to violence and situations impacting Central America. Is there a migration crisis in Nicaragua, and where are they showing up? Anybody?
If I may, historically, Nicaraguans are an exception in terms of migration patterns in comparison to neighboring Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Nicaraguans tend to migrate to Costa Rica. So yes.
How many have gone to Costa Rica?
Officially over 80,000, which is it's unprecedented numbers for a country of the size of Nicaragua. However, for the very first time in many, many years, we are seeing significant numbers of Nicaraguans at the U.S. border seeking for asylum.
Thank you. TPS, I am supportive of TPS for Nicaraguans. The Trump administration hasn't been as supportive. The courts have weighed in. Given the a crisis which is further aggravated by the shutting down of hotels, restaurants, stores, even like street vendors, right? Which has led to a substantial number of folks being unemployed, further fueling the crisis. First, could you tell me what you feel about the crackdown or the shutdown of these small businesses, and what you also feel about the Trump administration's hardcore stance on extending TPS for Nicaraguans? Anybody from the panel?
If I may, the TPS is a fundamental need for Nicaraguans for various reasons.
So you support it?
Yes, yes. And I will also add my appreciation to the Nicaraguan diaspora, to Nicaraguan Americans who have been fundamental to the struggle of democracy for Nicaragua. In the case of Nicaragua, there is an interesting and very substantive characteristic of Nicaraguan migrants. Most of Nicaraguan migrants want to return to Nicaragua. We've done research on this. This is an exception to other migrant groups. So if we reestablish democracy in Nicaragua, also the immigration issue will be tackled.
What about small businesses? Anything?
In the terms of the small businesses, this is a clear example of the violations of human rights. About 35 small businesses have been closed recently, including pharmacies, including supermarkets, because they closed their shops in protest to the Ortega regime as part of the nonviolent struggle.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Congressman Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you all being here. Mr. Vivanco, the crimes you highlighted at the beginning are hideous in nature. Those that committed the horrendous charges of violence, did they act independent of Ortega's government? Or could they have acted independently and survive Ortega's authoritarianism?
No. According to the our evidence and evidence that we are going to actually include in a forthcoming report about atrocities committed by security forces as well as pro-government groups that works jointly with those security forces, there is no chance that those atrocities could have been committed without the approval and endorsement of the government at the highest level.
Okay, and I think we can conclude the crimes could not have been orchestrated or carried out without the direct involvement of Daniel Ortega's knowledge and or approval. That would be correct with all of you, right?
Yes.
All right, I've got a report here from the UN Commissioner of High Human Rights. The Ortega administration repressed these demonstrators back when they repressed the demonstrators before the elections. In August of 2018, then United Nations High Commissioner of Human Rights Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein asserted the violence and repression seen in Nicaragua since demonstrations began in April are products of the systematic erosion of human rights over the years and highlighted the overall fragility of the institutions and rule of law. The UN comes out and says that, but nothing gets done. The OAS still trades with Nicaragua. We entered an FTA with the Caribbean nations, some of the Dominican Republic and the Central American nations. My question is, why are we still trading with somebody like this? Why in the heck do the civilized free world tolerate people like Daniel Ortega? I mean, we're all against what he does. We're all against what he says. We see these actions. The UN goes down there and they talk about all these atrocities, yet everything goes on. Human trafficking is going on, smuggling of drugs, the repression, the torture that you guys brought up. In a civilized world, we do not tolerate these things. What can we do different? We have invested millions and hundreds of millions of dollars since, over the decades in Nicaragua. And it goes for good governance, rule of law, economic development. I want to know where the hell it is for my American taxpayers. I want to know where it is for the people of Nicaragua. That 80,000 that you said fled to Costa Rica, what time period was that?
That was since May of last year. Right now, numbers have been probably much higher.
Sure, they're going to go up higher.
But if I may, sir, back to your question, you are absolutely correct. The generosity of the United States after the civil war in Nicaragua has been tremendous in building civil society, helping build a human rights community. And when you ask where are those people, most of them are in prison, are in exile, and that's why Mr. Ortega labels these people as terrorists, because there's an investment in terms of training in human rights, civil society, that has been disregarded by Ortega.
Well, we in the free world need to wake up, because what we have is we've got Nicaragua, you've got the failed regime of Hugo Chavez carried out through Maduro, we've got what's going on in Cuba, we've got Russian interference in the Western Hemisphere, and basically they're all communist nations that are operating in the Western Hemisphere, and there was a time in this country where we would not tolerate that. And I think we need to go back, if we are serious about what we said, and if we really want to bring an end to this and get some stability and empower the people of those countries. China's over there doing whatever they're doing. I'm over time, aren't I? No, it's still going. I'm on yellow. I looked at the wrong one. China's over there, and if we're going to do this, let's do it right. And I want to know, and I would love to have an hour conversation with all of you, what do we need to do different that we haven't done? I mean, we know what causes good societies, this rule of law, honoring human rights, and things like that, and we all talk about it, but we don't do it. I for one, recommend that we get rid of trade with Nicaragua. Let them trade with China. That'll work out well for them. Maybe they can build a dam like they did in Ecuador. I think we just need to have some strong talk and follow through with it, and stop playing the games and having, God bless you for coming up here talking about human rights and all that. We agree in that, we believe in that, and we need to come together as civilized nations and say enough's enough. I don't have any other questions, I just appreciate y'all being here.
Thank you, Congressman. Congressman Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start out with what Mr. Levin said, because our hand and how we've dealt in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in Central and South America, is not clean, where we have supported dictators and others when it was in our interests. So in listening, and I do have concerns about what's taking place there, but if we were to withdraw all of the aid and everything else that we give to Nicaragua, will that make things better for the people of Nicaragua? That's my first question. Mr. Levanko?
Congressman Meeks, no, I'm not advocating for some broad sanctions that might have an impact on the living conditions of the Nicaraguans. What I'm advocating for, and I'm a strong believer, is on targeted sanctions. And everything else, in my experience, working for over 30 years on human rights issues in Latin America, is that what usually works is engagement, not isolation. Engagement, but with conditions, with strings attached.
I'm with you on that. So what puzzles me at times with where we go, I'm trying to think of a time in the Western Hemisphere where unilateral sanctions worked. There was not an engagement or not, working with other countries that in the area. Has there been a time where unilateral sanctions worked, which is, I think, being advocated here? Any one of you? In the Western Hemisphere, has there been any time that you can recall? Because
I will argue that Nicaragua is a perfect example in the 1980s. We saw one of the most bloody civil wars in Nicaraguan, in Latin American history, and we actually saw how U.S. sanctions brought Nicaragua back to democracy in 1990. I will also argue that the fact that Nicaragua, and Ortega in particular, was outside of the radar for many, many years, made the problem to emerge again.
Okay, because I'm trying to see, I know that when you talk about Nicaragua and you talk about a number of the scenarios, particularly back when President Reagan was around, we did some unscrupulous things there. And so we're still paying for that to a large degree. And so I was strained to think of Can you tell me where the other countries are, like, folks from the OAS? Are they, agreeing in the same methods, or is this still just a unilateral sanctions area for the United States of America? Because and the other piece is what I'm trying to, because I'm for democracy also, not just for regime change. So I want to know where the U.S. has required regime change has resulted in a democratic government with human rights, et cetera, when it's just the United States, particularly by itself.
Please allow me to say that Nicaraguans believe that the mistakes of the past cannot be an impediment for the current exercise of the U.S. leadership in promoting human rights. And I will also insist on the importance of multilateral action. In this regard, I would like to publicly appreciate, first of all, the leadership of Ambassador Carlos Trujillo, U.S. Ambassador to the OAS, but also other missions to the OAS, such as the mission of Colombia, Argentina, Chile, and many others who are with us in this collective effort.
And that's, tremendously important, I think, to make sure that when I hear conversations about sanctions, et cetera, that it's got to be at a multilateral level. The one time that I know when sanctions was very strong was in South Africa. The United States was last to come on board, but it was multilateral. It was everybody. But if you just do it on an individual basis, it doesn't seem to me to be quite as effective. Also, what my concern is, I guess I'm out of time, is someone, I don't know, one of you has said that if there was elections that happened today that Ortega would get reelected. That's a concern because I do want to make sure that, though that the people's voices are heard and that we just don't overturn an election because it's the people voted for someone that we didn't want to vote, unless we're talking about an election that was committed under fraud. I'm out of time, so I yield back.
Congressman Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Since the Trump administration, we're seeing a massive decline in our foreign assistance around the world, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. I think that compromises both our national security and certainly the security and safety of the residents of the countries in question. The administration is proposing a 40% reduction in assistance this year to only $6 million. Money is not always the answer alone. My question for each of you, starting with you, Mr. Vivanco, is what are the best practices, as you've seen our country practice around the world in similar circumstances, and what level of funding, in your estimation, is appropriate to affect what is in our best interest?
Congressman Phillips, I think the key is to make sure that there is always enough resources available to support civil society, to strengthening the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary, to press countries that have an undemocratic structure and record to reform its legislation to allow for a real checks and balance on the executive. So all of those goals should be always be present in the U.S. foreign policy and should be supported with sufficient resources.
And sir, where have you seen us affect that effectively?
Well, there are many examples in Latin America. I think the U.S., across, if we're looking into from the 90s up to today, there are good examples of, in Chile, for instance, in Peru, reforms that allows for more transparency and strengthening the rule of law, including Colombia, I think is a good example. Colombia is not a perfect example. There are many problems there still, but there have been some, I would say, conscientious effort to support the rule of law and the independent judiciary in that country. I wish that we could have better examples, let's say, in Central America, and including Mexico. But unfortunately, the record is pretty poor.
I appreciate it. Mr. Maradiaga.
I will emphasize in five key best practices. These are not all, but just a quick summary. Funding the strengthening of civil society, particularly independent human rights organizations. Supporting the free press. Civic education of youth, particularly of underrepresented minorities such as indigenous communities and women. Technical support to electoral systems, and anti-corruption and transparency initiatives.
And where do you think we have affected those initiatives well?
I think that the work of particularly of agencies such as USAID in the case of Nicaragua has been fantastic.
Yes, good.
Precisely what we see when we saw hundreds of students asking for democracy, women asking for democracy, and something impressive, which are faith-based organizations working along leaders of the LGBT community, for example, working together for the same objectives. That doesn't come out of magic. That's the result of many, many years building inclusive civil society. And I will take also time to appreciate the support of U.S. taxpayers in supporting civil society in Nicaragua.
And do you have a sense of what's an appropriate level of funding? $6 million, I trust, can't accomplish that.
I think it's of course a very, very small number in comparison to what the U.S. is investing in other nations of the world. That is less than 25% of the support that Nicaragua used to have in the early 90s.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Doctor.
Yes, I disagree. I believe that some of the assistance that have been going to the region has been plagued by rent-seeking. 50–60% of the money stay here in the U.S. To pay for NICRA of the organization. The organization charged 20, 28, 30% of NICRA. It is about fighting for the foreign assistance to maintain a high level, but also begins to request also from the implementers to fulfill some impact and measure by impact. $6 million in Nicaragua can be a good amount of money, but the problem if we take away 50%, 60% of that money to maintain the organizations here in Washington, D.C., we are not making a major favor to the assistance that we are providing for democracy and human rights in the region.
Thank you, sir. I'm out of time. I yield back.
Yeah.
Thank you, Congressman. I have one question. You know, I always read about the power behind the presidency, which is supposed to be Ortega's wife. Is that accurate? How much say does she have in the country?
That's absolutely accurate, and there is a very sad episode that really explains part of that, and this is in the public record. It has been widely documented. The rape of Ortega's stepdaughter, and when Ms. Soy La America came out publicly to denounce the rape, Rosario Murillo supported Daniel Ortega. Daniel Ortega would be absolute history if that particular crime would have been taken into justice. But Rosario Murillo supported Daniel Ortega clearly in exchange for the piece of the pie. And that's how the Ortega family sees Nicaragua, as a pie that they share among their inner circle.
Anybody else have any other comments?
Yeah, I was detained and I was expelled from Nicaragua by a direct order of Rosario Murillo. And when the ambassador tried to negotiate, the Rosario Murillo directly say, I'm the one who rules the country here. So it is also a problem that Daniel Ortega managed some of the negotiations, the big negotiations, but she's in control of the operation of the government. She's in control of the violence. She's in control of major things in the country, and she sees herself as a major power behind Daniel Ortega. And as Felix said, talking with Soy La America talks about the corruption and how she maintained the whole structure of corruption behind Daniel Ortega too.
So if Daniel Ortega steps down, you think she runs for president?
I believe that Daniel Ortega will try to run again. And if not, she will try to run. They will maintain, they want immunity, impunity, and also maintain control. This couple has been in power, directly or indirectly, for 4 decades in Nicaragua. So they're not going to leave as easy as week 1.
Well, look, this has been a very interesting hearing, and I want to thank you for coming. We keep reading about Nicaragua. We keep reading about some of the other countries in the region. but Nicaragua is now standing out. You know, I was hopeful that other countries like Guatemala was going in the right direction, but now they seem to have taken a step back. And it's very disheartening when you push, as I do, for the Western Hemisphere, that they take a step forward and then they take two, 3 steps back. And you have to constantly defend that we have to get more involved in the Western Hemisphere. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here today for this important hearing. The crisis in Nicaragua continues at the hands of the Ortega regime. I want to reiterate my support for the Nicaraguan people and their tireless effort to fight for democracy. I thank our witnesses for being here today, and with that, I adjourn the hearing.